out of the blue, right before the first hearing, he said to me, "Why don't you just go on your own? Like, go by myself." And I said, "I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, you're my lawyer." I did not believe at that point, at that time, that, I mean, yes, I could handle my own lawsuits when I wasn't being tortured and when I had at least a little bit of money and access to a law library. You know, those things were secure. I could do a lot, and a lot of people knew that, had found that out. When I didn't have hardly any money and I wasn't living next to a law library, I had no resources for looking things up. And and then I was in this situation of kind of looking like a weirdo to people. How was it going to be beneficial to my son and my case for me to go on my own and just show up there? And he'd already talked to the court, like he'd already sort of announced his presence. So then I'm going to show up without him. And he said, "Well, why don't you just go on your own and I'll be second chair." Like, he wanted me to be the person in charge, and then he would just kind of back me up, but he wasn't going to be at that hearing. He said that he couldn't go. So he backed out at the last minute. And then I told my parents, and then they said, "Well, you can't back out of that, going to that attorney, after you just signed up with him." And then they said that he was the only one that I could use, but my mother's sister even said that attorney said that he didn't think it was a good idea. I'm not sure that he was the best person to get ideas from, because he hasn't always worked for me at all. And that was Kyle Flick. But he said that he thought it was odd that he just backed out and wanted me to go on my own too. So, I mean, if I could have seen the point of, like, if I had presented myself and they could see that I was speaking on my own and cogent and everything, that I would be demonstrating that I'm not nuts. However, I didn't know family law, and it's not like I had a year to research and do some of my own footwork as I had with the other lawsuits that I filed on my own in Oregon first. I mean, first, before I filed those lawsuits, I was looking up some of the laws. And I didn't expect to have to file on my own, but I wanted to know what the laws were because I wasn't sure what kind of a case I had. So I was curious to know. And that's how I was able to do a little research ahead of time. But to be suddenly, and not only that, when I had my son taken from me, I was so completely traumatized, I couldn't hardly think straight. I mean, I was contacting lawyer after lawyer, plotting as quickly as I could through all of this mess. And yet, every time I tried to approach something like family law and thought about my son, it was horrible. I mean, when it's that close to your heart, it's really hard to be your own attorney. So, it's getting really dark in here now. At least the camera is, and it's blurring. The camera is blurring. Turn the light on. That didn't really help. So, basically, after he told me to be my own attorney at the very last minute, didn't give me any prior notice on that, I knew that something was wrong. I mean, if he'd even given me a little bit of a heads up, it would have been helpful, and maybe I could have considered the idea, but he didn't do that. So, then he was sending me email just saying, it was just a complete reversal from what he had said he was going to do. And I didn't really think at the time about everything being so connected to the military. I just thought maybe somebody bribed him, is what I thought. I thought maybe he talked to someone and someone convinced him not to do it, and he got paid. So that was the only thing that would have really benefited him. I mean, what benefit did he get out of it? We were paying him to represent me. So either he is going to be representing me, or he's taking bribes from someone. Because, doesn't a lawyer want your money? I mean, especially if they believe that you have a case, as he knew I did. And he needed work. And he was being paid. So what would cause a military experienced lawyer to turn down being paid for a case that he knew was a valid case, and he had never disputed that? The one thing that now that I know how my parents are involved with the military, the one thing I regret is that he was able to talk to my mother privately. I gave him permission to speak with my mother, and probably some kind of coercion and intimidation came into those conversations, because since my parents have to work for the government, I am sure that he was making suggestions that or acting as a messenger for someone possibly. I think that had I been privy to the conversations, I listened and heard what the conversations were about all the time, I think I would have had a better idea of what was going on. It's also possible that my mother, for some reason, was being pressured to say something to him about the case. I mean, maybe someone was pressuring my mother to say, who knows, something that would affect him. But so then after that, I was told, well, you didn't stick with that attorney, now you don't get one. Basically, it's kind of like the FBI's and military's been dictating to my parents whether or not they can help out with different things or not, with regard to me or my son. And I saw that with this whole attempt of my trying to appeal the case for my son. I was being tortured, and I saw my parents with signs of clear torture. And the worst of it was being done when there were deadlines for the appeals and getting my son back. So my parents were refusing to allow me to even use the printer for any kind of a legal document that helped my son. And I had a very strong feeling that people in this community, including people who are pastors that have all this military experience, they were part of, and the police, they were part of acting as bouncers and enforcing their silence and cooperation in not helping me at all, because this country has kidnapped my child, and basically the United States didn't want me to get my son back. I mean, why would they torture me in the middle, non-stop, all the way through the appeals? The worst of the torture, to the point that it was completely disabling, was at that time, and then right before they took my son. So first they wanted to create the crazy looking person who is so tortured, and my son was so tortured, that then they go in and kidnap my son for me, and then torture him worse. And then, any time that this country has tried to keep me from challenging any kind of harm that's been done to me, they've tortured me. It hasn't been research. That's not research. You don't torture someone every single time someone is trying to enforce their civil rights. That's anti-competition and hate crime. So that's what happened with that lawyer. And I had to show up at the hearing by myself. And of course it didn't go well. And when I did show up at the very first hearing, it was the judge, CPS, and Thomas Caballero for the Attorney General of Washington through Wenatchee. It was a ton of women who hated me. They had every single woman from social services and CPS that wanted to retaliate against me for winning the Fair Hearings lawsuit against them. Basically, it is a lawsuit. You're filing a fair hearing saying that you're being discriminated against or whatever. I won, and they were perjuring themselves, some of them, on the record. Well, every single woman that had ever tried to do anything that hated me, or there were literally, it was crazy. These women looked like the worst catty squad. I mean, I wish that I had a picture, because there they were, probably about 15 of them. I was going to say 10 to 20. Close to 15 to 20. And they were all from social services and CPS. Not all of those women had anything to do with my case or my social services work or anything like that. I mean, but there were a bunch of different women there that just stared at me with hate. I remember Tina Thornton was there, and she stared at me with hate and revenge. She hated me. And she wanted revenge. And this is the woman who was best friends with Brett McDonald, who had counseled me and didn't want to see anything bad about the FBI. And again, as I say, Tina Thornton was the woman who tipped police off and tried to tell them that I was driving without insurance, with expired insurance, when actually I wasn't. And that's why I kept getting pulled over and harassed by police, because her husband was a cop. And she decided that she wanted to try to get me on something. She also got the raise and promotion to work for CPS instead of social services after she tried to do something bad to me. So I remember her expression. I remember seeing Tina there, and I remember her expression. I just remember feeling shocked. I couldn't believe that those vindictive witches were so corrupt and filled with hate that they would do that to me and my son. And then they were all grouped together, looking at me with this hatred and satisfaction at the same time. And then, aside from the lawyers and these hateful women that were grouped together, like a bunch of cats, then there was Tony Block off to the side of them. He was like the only man who appeared to have nothing to do with it. I didn't know who this tall Italian man was that was staring at me with hatred either. I didn't know who he was. I found out years later that Tony Block is an Italian American that works for CPS, and he was the last individual to tell me to serve me with parental termination rights and to mock me over it. He also took things from my son, took things away from my son. And since I later found out Tony Block was so interested to the point that he wanted to be there at the very first hearing, and he wanted to be the closer at the very last hearing, I know for a fact that he's connected to the Italian-American man who raped me, with the police standing by. So that's what Tony Block does for Wenatchee. Those were the individuals in the courthouse. And basically the first entire thing was just like a preliminary matter. And the judge it didn't matter what I had. I asked for discovery, and they refused to give me discovery. And the judge just slam dunk said that the state was awarded temporary custody of my son. And then there was going to be another hearing down the road where it was quote-unquote contested shelter care, which is when the court really determines if it's going to be just a temporary arrangement or if they're going to make my son a guardian of the state and force me to comply with quote-unquote services. So that was the first hearing, and I will never forget the looks on the faces of the people who were there. I will never forget who was there, and God will never forget who was there. I know that God knows that I am innocent, and I have always been innocent.